All right, Emily, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Okay.
Hey, great.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone who's already joined us and is in the process of joining us. My name is John Gartrell, and I serve as the director of the John Hope Franklin Research Center for African and African American History and Culture in the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at Duke University. It's my honor to host this event for today. And thank you all so much for taking the opportunity and time out of your day to join us for what I anticipate will be a riveting talk by our speaker this afternoon. So first and foremost, I just wanted to give everyone a little bit of a sense of what the purpose for the event and the occasion for this talk is. The 2021 and 2022 academic year actually marks the 25th anniversary of the John Hope Franklin Research Center. The Franklin Research Center is based in the Rubenstein Library here at Duke, and we're going to be using the theme Black Lives and Archives as the thread for a slate of programming and projects that will build upon the center's mission of advancing scholarship on the history and culture of people of African descent. And our founding roots are that in 1995, Dr. John Hope Franklin, who was then the James B. Duke Emeritus Professor of History at Duke, donated his own personal archive to the library here. And in his honor, the Duke University Libraries founded the Franklin Research Center as a designated collecting area specializing in rare book and primary source materials documenting people of African descent. And it was accompanied with some endowment funding from the Glaxo Wellcome Incorporated Company. Franklin's archive and his scholarship have been the guiding lights of the center's engagement in public programming, teaching, exhibitions, and collaborations. And this celebration of Black Lives and Archives will honor the center's role as a premier destination for researchers near and far over the last 25 years. So as a reminder, this event is being recorded, and we'll hopefully be sharing this out once a few days after we can get everything downloaded and uploaded again to the internet on the Duke Library's YouTube page. Our program today is going to be about 40 to 45 minutes or so. And then we'll leave some time at the end for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions. My esteemed colleague, Meg Brown, who is our head of exhibitions here in Duke Libraries, will be monitoring the Q&A box as well as the chat. So if you have questions that pop up along the way, please feel free to type those in, and Meg will share them out to the audience once we get to the completion of the lecture part of our program today. And then after the Q&A, we have a special slideshow, which will be about 10 minutes for those who are unable to come on campus and view the Vandersee and Michael Francis Blake exhibition. You'll get a chance to see some of the images used as well as what the gallery space looks like. And then hopefully that'll at least give you a preview for those who can come to Duke and come on campus to actually view the exhibition. And without any more delay, I will go ahead and introduce our speaker for the afternoon. Dr. Emily Boone is an assistant professor of art history at New York City College of Technology, CUNY. She's a scholar of art and visual culture of the African diaspora with a focus on photography, and has a forthcoming book on photographer James Vandersee. Her lecture is entitled Visualizing a Shared Ethos, Vandersee and Blake as Peers, and it will be a response to an exhibition entitled James Vandersee and Michael Francis Blake, Picturing Blackness in the 1920s, which is currently on display in the David M. Rubenstein Library through October the 17th of this year. The exhibit is sponsored by the Franklin Research Center as part of its 25th anniversary commemoration. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Boone, or Emily. And so please, look forward to you sharing with our audience today.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm honored to join you today for the Franklin Research Center 25th anniversary opening. As Dr. Gartrell mentioned, I'm a scholar of African American art and of photography, and I'm currently writing a book on the photographer James Vandersee. For me, learning about Blake and reframing Vandersee in relationship to Blake has been an insightful exercise. I look forward to sharing my thoughts on these two incredible photographers in my talk today, which is titled Visualizing a Shared Ethos, Vandersee and Blake as Peers. And I'm gonna ask for the slide to be added. Wonderful. Okay, we can start with the second slide. I know Dr. Gartrell is going to show you slides of the exhibit at the very end, but I kind of wanted to start my talk with this one, which gives you an exhibition view at one of the angles of the exhibit. The current Rubenstein exhibit includes a selection of works from the early 20th century by Vandersee and Blake, culled from Duke's collection. The show highlights how both artists epitomize the Harlem Renaissance era, which was an artistic and cultural movement that fostered racial pride and celebrated Black culture. In my talk today, I'm going to expand upon the show's premise by arguing that each photographer leveraged aspects of photography's materiality in order to serve their communities and celebrate the diversity of people in both cities. You may have questions about what I mean about the materiality of photography, and I'm going to cover that in my lecture. First, I wanted to step back and spend some time with some of the images that are in the show. So I'm going to ask for the next slide, please. Thank you. So on the left-hand side, we have a group portrait by Michael Francis Blake, a Charleston, South Carolina studio photographer. At the time, most likely the only Black photographer in Charleston. He ran a studio at 384 West Sumter Street. Blake catered mostly to an African-American clientele, and most of his portraits were taken in the studio with subjects either standing or seated. He passed away in 1934, and he was taking photographs up until his last years of life. Duke has 118 of Blake's photographs within its archives. On the right-hand side, we have a photograph by James Vandersee, who was a Harlem, New York studio photographer. Unlike Blake, he was one amongst several local photographers in his city. There were various Black photographers, literally all within a couple blocks within Vandersee. He ran his studio with his wife, Ganella Greenlee. Greenlee was her maiden name. And he ran 4 sequential studios. So he would only run one at a time, and then he would close one and then open another, all within Harlem. He moved really within basically a number of different streets. So he was always kind of really centrally located. He lived a very long life in photography. He was born in 1886, and he passed away in 1983. Similarly, Vandersee photographed people until the last year of his life. And he left behind a gigantic archive of more than 10,000 photographs. Even though, Blake and Vandersee are from different locations, have a very different history, what they share in common is really the range and the diversity of people and personalities that they captured in their photographs. It's really compelling, as we can see in this group shot that we can begin to compare here. On the left, Blake is capturing a man and 2 women who are, I don't know if they're related or friends, but it's definitely a reflection of a familial or like a friendship, very close relationship. Look at the style of the hair and, the selectiveness and the put togetherness of what they're wearing. Blake captures them by kind of zooming into the shot. We get a sense of the backdrop, but not to the same extent as the Vandersee photograph. This photograph of Vandersee was taken in 1924. And as per the name, it represents a father and a son who are Garveyites. In 1924, that was the year that Vandersee became Garvey's official photographer. So you can imagine he was he was hired to take photos not only of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA on the street, but many of the Garveyites ended up going to the studios and for their own self-representation in portraits such as this. Again, very carefully composed photograph, just like the Blake. One of the major differences being all the sort of accoutrement that is around the figures. You can see a stuffed fake dog on the floor. You can see flowers. You can see a very kind of dramatic backdrop. Those are the things that really made Vandersee very distinct from his peers in Harlem, and to a certain extent distinct from his peers throughout the country. But at the heart of both photographs is this sense of capturing Black relationships, different types of relationships, either friendships, familial, or like a lineage, like father and son. Next slide. Thank you. I chose this one. It's, when you're looking at these images, you always figure out which one is one of your favorite. And for me, this really resonated for me. This is by Blake. It's a young woman. She is dressed very carefully. You can see she has jewelry, she has her coat on. One of the things that I noticed that you see in a lot of Blake's images is that the figures have their hands propped up on either a chair or some kind of stand like this. It almost makes the figures kind of take up space as they did in more traditional portraits that were painted, centuries ago. Taking up that space almost gives them a sense of power. This is a very kind of intentionally composed portrait. We can also see the backdrop includes the window, right? That light is streaming in, and Blake has reinforced that sense of a window being there by lighting her face in a particular way. I bring this up to say that not only was there like a diversity of people who were coming through both studios, but both artists, both photographers were very intentional and mindful in how they were posing and representing the figures. We can even imagine a collaboration between the subject and the photographer, something that was a common thread between the two photographers, even though they were, cities and miles apart. Next, please. Here, in addition, so we've seen group shots, the one portrait of the woman, and I wanted to make this comparison because I think it really reflects both photographers and their capturing subjects that are potentially, well, what we know about the Barefoot Prophet is that he was he evangelicized on the streets of Harlem. And as you can see, he does not have any shoes. Also in the shadow, there is a little tambourine that is sort of his calling card, if you will. And he sits before a book. He is represented as like an erudite, someone who is educated and knowledgeable. Blake does the same in his photograph on the right-hand side. The man is very kind of sternly and strongly standing, holding his book. We don't know, I don't know if he is a person of letters, if he's an educator, or if he's a person of the church. But through the props, we are able to kind of come to certain conclusions about these people and their characteristics. And I would wage that they both personalities had something in common. Maybe not as quirky as the Barefoot Prophet without his shoes, but definitely in the sense of being people of knowledge, people of the mind. Next slide, please. And this, I just love this comparison. I'm so happy that both of these photographs are in the show at the Rubenstein. On the right-hand side, you have Vandersee's Bow of the Ball, one of his really well-known portraits. And it is a figure who is very extravagantly dressed and is about to head to a drag ball. On the left-hand side, we have a woman who is wearing a tie and who's wearing what is traditionally a male suit. Both individuals are subverting gender norms. One is doing so in Harlem, the other one is doing so in Charleston, South Carolina. Again, a link, even though that there's vast geographic distances, we see common themes that are true of most communities, African-American communities throughout the United States. And both Blake and Vandersee capture that diversity and depict them with the same sense of pride and dignity as any other client who is walking into their studio. Next slide. And in addition to delving into and really thinking about the composition of this photograph, something that really caught my eye was how worn the photograph is. If you look on the left-hand side of the photograph, you can see little lines. And whenever I see photographs that are like this, it leads to a number of other questions about how was this photograph used? Whose hands did it pass through? When it passed through hands, was it turned over? What does the back look like? How long was it held? Was it held in albums? It gets to the point that these photographs function as actual objects that are held in hands and passed between friends, lovers, and family, and even postal workers, if we think about photographs being sent through the mail. I was very intrigued that most of Blake's portraits in Duke's collection are printed on cardstock, which was very common at this time. So meaning, if you take this photograph and flip it over, most likely you would see, the back of what we are familiar with a postcard. And these oftentimes, these photo postcards were made for sending messages to people or as keepsakes to save, trade, or share among friends. The materiality of photography, as in the very physical format of the images, informs how we can talk about both Blake and Vandersee's work. The composition of a photograph tells us a story, but so does the photograph as an object that is produced with its purpose and use in mind. Next slide, please. And this is probably one of my other favorite photographs in the exhibit, not only because I'm really struck with how the woman is very thoughtfully positioned and seated in a very comfortable pose, but also, and I don't know if this comes up very clearly on the slide, you might have to visit the exhibit for this, but if you look right under her feet that part, the bottom part of the photograph, you see a stamp, and it is like a raised stamp that kind of cuts into the paper, and that creates like little like raised paper and ridges, and you will be able to make out assumably the name of the photographer of Blake and his address. This was very common for photographers at this time. It's something that Vandersee did on the front side of a lot of his photographs by signing his name, the date, and then putting, New York, NY. And then he also did it on the back with stamps that would have similar information that we see there. Photographers did this for a range of reasons. As I was talking about the postcard, if there's a stamp and the postcard is sent in the mail and goes, to a friend up in the north, people will know where the photograph was taken. It's a way to create a conversation between the photograph and the viewer, of place and context. It's also a way to advertise business. So if you are in the Carolinas and you see this and you see that stamp, you might be compelled to go to Blake's studio. All these things kind of add to the very meaning of the photograph, in addition to the representation of the image. Next slide, please. And I was also, just when reading about the Blake collection, I was also very intrigued and really excited that one of the initiatives that has taken place around the Blake photographs is trying to identify the sitters. These efforts that took place in the 1990s led to a number of photographs being identified by the names and familial relationships among people that lived locally in Charleston. What a fantastic direction to take the Blake collection. I'm asking, what would it mean to ask and inquire about how Blake's photographs as objects functioned and how they traveled? Next slide. Since many of Blake's portraits were printed on portrait stock, what would it mean to think about his photographs as traveling to friends and family within Charleston, maybe to family living in other places? I have this slide that is up is not included in the show, but I think it's an actual photograph from maybe a little bit before the Harlem Renaissance era, but it really shows how how photo cards were used. They were used to send images. But they were also used to send messages and to continue correspondences between people, especially those who, for example, we're talking the Harlem Renaissance era, those who might have headed north for the Great Migration. And for lots of Vandersee's clientele, we can imagine a lot of his clients were sending, some of their photographs back south or back west to family members. This is kind of central for me for understanding photography and within Black communities at this time, and just to imagine and open up the conversation for this possibility of this happening to Blake's photographs, even if they traveled within the neighborhood, is really shifts how we can think about the significance of them. And it's going to be, next slide, please. And so these questions about the sort of multifaceted roles of photography, how they were used beyond, just representing the subject, is something that I've asked repeatedly about Vandersee's photographs. And I include an example here of how Vandersee's photographs found their way in advertisements. Here we have a Vandersee photograph called Christmas Morning. This is from a private collection. It's not in the show. And it is included in a calendar of a local Harlem business. This is 1935. We can go to the next slide. And we can compare that calendar featuring the Vandersee image to a Vandersee photograph on the left-hand side, Undeclared War, that is actually in the show at the Rubenstein. This is such a fantastic image. It's called Undeclared War. It's kind of supposed to be tongue-in-cheek. The woman is sitting, waiting for someone to come home and is not happy about that person's lateness. And this was, obviously completely staged and has a really strong narrative force to it. And it was created specifically for calendars like the one on the right-hand side. So Vandersee is speaking to an audience beyond just sort of the one-on-one clientele who comes in. These photographs are speaking to a much larger audience and have a number of different uses through sort of the very material format of their kind of existence. Next slide, please. This is also the case. I mentioned Marcus Garvey before. I'm going to return to him for a second. On the left-hand side here, we have a page from the Negro World, which is an international newspaper that was produced by the UNIA. And we have a page from 1924 that includes a series all taken by Vandersee, all reproduced within the newspaper, and then really circulated throughout the world for audiences to see. The image that is in the Rubenstein collection, the photograph on the right-hand side, again, is that portrait of the Garveyite family. We can kind of make connections between the role of photography as it relates to the Garvey movement and Garveyite participants at the time. This newspaper really allows us to extend the ways and expand the ways that we can think about this very portrait between a father and a son, no longer just a photograph that kind of, sits on a mantle. It operates within a larger network of images, that have traveled throughout the world, like the ones that are depicted in the Negro World. Next slide, please. And although the Negro World kind of reached very far and wide, we can think of examples that are really close to home. This is, again, not an object that's in the exhibit, but one that really kind of enhances how we can think about studio photographs from the Harlem Renaissance era. Here is this fantastic album that I had the pleasure of seeing at the Schomburg Library in Harlem, New York. And it is a scrapbook by a gentleman by the name of Maurice Hunter. And on the left-hand side of the scrapbook, we see 3 photographs by James Vandersee. On the right-hand side, we see a photograph by one of his Harlem photography peers by the name of James Latimer Allen, a very well-known photographer at the time as well. Looking at this curated space, curated in 1928, has a very different resonance than how me as a scholar might organize photographs. You see how the photographs are relating to one another, how they're kind of placed on the page. This is one page of many pages. And we kind of see how each photograph ends up making meaning, making commentary in relationship in relationship to the next. And I love examples like this where we can actually see how the studio photographs are sort of in use in their historical context, and we have an idea of that through these kind of primary documents that we can look to. I'm going to go to the next slide. And here we have a slide of two of Blake's photographs. And we're just going to take a moment to look at them because they're both amazing photographs. On the left-hand side, actually, we can start with both. And remember, at the very beginning of the lecture, I talked about the tendency for Blake subjects to be posed with one hand kind of, resting on something. We see this in both of these photographs. And on the right-hand side, she has a chair, and then it is sort of leaning towards her. I've never seen that in a photograph. It's so, it's so startling and so kind of compelling to look at that photograph, not only what she's doing with the chair, but also what she's wearing, her hat, she has some jewelry or like a necklace on. She's holding gloves in the left-hand side. Only one of her feet are peeking out at the bottom. Just really wonderfully composed. We have something very similar on the left-hand side where we have a very kind of elaborate backdrop. It almost looks like a rug. And again, this young man is standing up so straight, so formally, and is wearing his gloves, and you can get a sense of the scale, his height, as he stands next to that stand. Both of them are capturing so much about each individual. They're both really, really wonderful portraits. If we think about them as material objects, we can even expand our thinking a little bit farther. For example, according to the Rubenstein Library, the majority of the Blake photographs were originally housed in an album, in a photograph album entitled Portraits of Members. How wonderful and fantastic to think about the organization of that original photo album. Would these two individuals be next to each other? Might their proximity, could we make conclusions about their relationship because of their proximity? Were they family? What were they members of? I'm just so curious, and would be so curious to see the original, not only the organization of those photographs, but how they're laid down on the page, and how those little tiny decisions about sort of how we engage with them materially, how that can tell us more about the photograph, and how it can tell us more about how photography was used, how it functioned during the Harlem Renaissance period for Black sitters. So as curators and scholars, we can definitely put photographs side by side as I have done here. We can arrange them in frames and try to recontextualize them to better understand their meaning and significance. However, when we explore details of how the photographs were actually used during their day as postcards or as part of an album or as an enlargement, they take on a new meaning. One that expands our understanding of the role of photography in Black communities, and one that enhances our understanding of the Harlem Renaissance years. As peers, Blake and Vandersee, although they never met, And although they were located in very different places, they both offer important insight into the role of photographs beyond the visual composition alone. They show us how photographs become living objects that move, that stay still, and that serve in relationship to other images. This is another way Blake and Vandersee allow us to picture Blackness. This is a way to visualize a shared ethos in leveraging the power of photography and all that it offered to Black photographers, to subjects and viewers in Charleston, in Harlem, and everywhere in between. Thank you. That is my last slide.
I'll come back on here. Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciated that. And especially the way that you sort of wove the two artists together and the subjects. It was really interesting to try and pull this exhibit together. And I'll go a little bit more about the background in a moment, but I want to make sure that, at least from the audience standpoint, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and start entering them into the chat and into the Q&A box there, and we'll work through those. So when we actually acquired the Vandersee portraits in 2019, and from the estate of Vandersee and his wife Donna, who you and I have both worked with closely. And we thought like, oh, this would be great to just do an exhibition with his prints. And I think the idea sort of came to me that, well, wait a minute, we also have this collection of another Black photographer who was in a totally different place, as you pointed out, but they were working at the same time. And I just wanted to sort of play in the sandbox of, what if we put both of their works sort of side by side? And I wondered, as you were going through, in terms of specifically Black photographers during this era, do you have a sense of how many there were in the country? What was the success rate? And how, well, this might be an impossible question to ask, but like, do you have a sense of what the corpus of what remains from that time period as well?
Right. That's a great question. It's actually a question that I delve into in my book, specifically with Harlem. For a lot of the scholarship that exists on Vandersee, it's almost implied that he was kind of at times sort of the only one, but that's definitely not the case. Vandersee was in a very, it was literally like a world of photography studios. One of the things that's really interesting about Harlem at the time is that not only were there a lot of photographers, but there were actually photography schools run by Black photographers. One of them was run by by the man of Walter Baker, and he actually advertised in Crisis magazine. And I wish I had the material to show you, but it's interesting. I was able to find an ad, and the ad celebrated recent graduates of the school, and it made the comment of, now that they're trained, they can go out into the world. They can go all over the United States. They listed cities like, in Florida, in the West, like really create this huge network of photographers, not only in, places like New York and Chicago, but really branch out. So I would say Black photographers were absolutely everywhere. They're really hard to historically account for a number of reasons. A lot of times, and this was definitely the case in Harlem too, photography studios opened up and they closed promptly after. So they were only open for a couple of years. And so I can imagine that happening literally throughout, the country, that sometimes photographers would exist and open up studios, but wouldn't be successful. So would need to close them very quickly. And if you do that, then, the chances of you having a record, a historical record of their existence becomes even harder. The other thing that makes it hard to sort of account for, the worlds of Black photography studios during the Harlem Renaissance era is the lack of archives. Vandersee is definitely an exception to the rule, having 10,000 and more photographs in his archive. What you'll find is something more commonly like the Blake collection. There aren't. I know Duke has 119. I don't know how many more out there, but I doubt it's tens of thousands of photographs. And there is a limited archive there. Another example, James Latimer Allen, the peer of Vandersee that I mentioned, the scholar who works on him by the name of Kamara Holloway, wrote a fantastic book on Latimer and mentioned that in existence now, there are less than 200 photographs, of identified as Latimer. And part of the reason that's the case was that his family, his wife, discarded the photographs in his, in like later in life. And so a lot of these photographs and these collections, they are disposed of. And so once a collection is thrown out, then there's no chance for a place like Duke or a place like the Schomburg to take care of the collections. So that's some of the challenges to studying photography studios of this time period. But I must say there are scholars, for example, Deb Willis, who have done sort of foundational research in this field. And part of that has been going back to the census and seeing how many Black photographers identify as, how many Blacks identify as photographers over a large chronological range. And so that's what scholars have done to sort of pinpoint. The numbers are always low. And I would like to say that, the argument can be made that it was always more than what, standard and standardized census records of that nature captured. So really, really great question, and something that I think a lot of us in thinking about photography and early Black photography are always wrestling with.
Yeah, my heart's kind of stopped when you mentioned throwing things away. As an archivist, it's just it's always a challenge, but it's a reality though. It's a real reality.
It's a reality. And also, we can go to Vandersee's story too. Vandersee in his later years in the late 60s, unfortunately went through, great personal upheaval and was going through a eviction with his then wife. And in the eviction, a lot of the photographs and the crates of photographs were thrown out on the street. Thankfully, a researcher was able to help him. But that is the destiny, unfortunately, of a lot of these collections. Yeah.
Do you want, should we bring up some of the questions coming up in chat?
Absolutely, go for it.
So Tiffany Green has asked, Vandersee's Undeclared War reminded me of one of Eugene Eckett's prints of home interiors. Who were some of Vandersee's influences?
Interiors. Vandersee's influences. When it's interesting, a lot of the interviews that were that Vandersee gave were in starting in the 70s after the Harlem on My Mind show, where he came to a larger audience. And so interviewers at that time would ask him, you know, who are your influences? And he really did not list many names, if really no names at all. He was really, you know, in Harlem running his own studio. There were definitely a network of other Black photographers, but the extent to their exchange and the extent to their influence is really unknown. So within the scholarship, you know, you have interviewers asking him, do you know Aaron Siskin? Do you know who Steichen is? Do you know, all of these, really famous white photographers who have been canonized within art history? And Vandersee does not know any of them. Now, the fact that he was not tapped into a more traditional, art historical narrative, that does not necessarily mean that he did not have peers. The way he engaged them is it's just different than how we can like list, oh, I saw these photographers and they influenced me. But I'm sure he was influenced by the photographer who is, down the street. The extent of that influence, I don't know. But if you're in an environment, if you're in a neighborhood that is filled with other photography studios, you're gonna look and, just, being in a world of images, those things are going to influence you. Other scholars have also said that Vandersee was probably influenced by, like, let's say, like, fashion magazines or photographs, because some of his photographs are very much aligned with kind of the glamour of the 1920s and 30s. So he definitely is being influenced, but I would say more by, visual culture and probably maybe the person down the street who he admired, as opposed to, going to exhibits and seeing Siskin and seeing all these things. But I think it's important to see that influence as being just as significant, as important than being able to run off a list of famous photographer names.
Great. Really interesting thoughts from Elizabeth Brown. Dr. Boone, thank you for this insightful and beautiful presentation on the photographs of James Vandersee and Michael Francis Blake. Thank you for pointing out the materiality of the image of the Black woman in clothes traditionally associated with men's clothing, the markings and indents of the photograph's life. You mentioned that many images functioned as postcards and that the workers delivering mail, I assume primarily male men at the time, would be handling these objects and therefore became part of the circulation and distribution of these images. In your research, have you come across any information about the workers of the mail system at this time? Who were the people handling these images, and could that have had some type of impact? Can looking through the lens of the mail system reveal anything about how these images were received by Black society and white society?
That's such a great question. How do I answer that? No, I actually do not know of any. I can't tell you any information about the post office in the 1920s and 30s, and how that might have influenced sort of, how we understand Vandersee's photographs and Black life. In my book project, I do a lot of research on the post office in the later years, in the later years of Vandersee's career, the 1940s and 50s, because that's when Vandersee stopped doing, well, he didn't stop. He in addition to taking studio portraits, he also had to start doing enlargement and enhancement services on photographs. And that clientele was actually from all over the world. He had advertisements in that were going in Christian magazines and traveling the world. And so, in interviews, he talks about getting these requests through the mail from literally from Europe, from Africa, from the Caribbean, all over, asking for enlargement, enhancement, and reproduction. And so I contextualize those images within the mail system of the 40s and 50s. But to be honest with you, it was such a hard chapter to write, because there isn't a lot of scholarship on the Postal Service and Black images. The closest that, and the most helpful research that has been done, and this is obviously a very, very different type of photograph, but historians of photography and of Black life have written a lot about lynching photographs and the post office, how they were able to travel. And the fact that those actually traveled a lot and no one stopped them, no one ripped them up. Did they travel as postcards on their own? Were they inside of envelopes? It raises all of these questions about the post office. I have talked to post office scholars at the Smithsonian Postal Museum, and I haven't gotten as far as I would like, but the kinds of questions that you're asking are such the questions that I have been asking too. And the conclusions that I've come to they've been kind of hard won, and a lot of it is speculative as well, unfortunately. But I love your question. You're thinking as the way that I'm thinking about Vandersee's photographs. Thank you for that question. I know I didn't really answer your question, but I hope that was useful.
I would say that's super informative. I can recall working with classes here in the library and students coming in, and we have a number of photographic collections that feature postcards, and Blake's images most of them are on postcards, but I often use materials that go back a little bit further in the sort of early 20th century, even late 19th century, that have sort of the stereotypical depictions of African Americans, and the cotton patches, the watermelon patches, the big lip, jigaboo style images, and sort of try to challenge them to think about what it means to have those kinds of images in circulation, that can actually just literally show up on your doorstep and then think about the person who is actually buying that thing and then writing a letter to a loved one on the back of it and then dropping it in the mail and sending it to family. So
yeah. But on the flip side of it, I mean, think about the impact and really the joy of getting an image enlarged, like an image of a family member, to send it to a studio and have it enlarged, or have extra copies made so that you can give to your aunt and your uncle. And it's a different kind of reproduction, a different kind of circulation, and one that Blake was involved in. I remember one of the materials you gave me mentioned that some of the families in Charleston have images made by Blake, but in different formats, like enlarged formats. And so he was participating in that practice as well, as was Vandersee, to enlarge and reproduce an image, is to sort of create, is to multiply these photographs, and have them kind of traveled and included in albums or circulated to family members. So there's something really powerful and beautiful about that, the multiplicity of what that photographs can be reproduced, and how Black families really kind of use that aspect of photography to kind of advance their relationships with friends and family.
So along those same lines, I wonder if you could also speak to the subjects in the photos. Like, what is it safe to presume that these were people who had means, or at least middle class, or they've been working class?
Right.
How routine was it to get photos? I mean, we all have cell phones and we take pictures all the time now. So,
Mhm.
um, what was the meaning for the people who were actually sitting for that portrait of having their picture taken?
Right, right. I mean, in terms of Vandersee, this issue of class is so interesting because most scholars assume that most of his clientele were middle class of people of means. And they come to those conclusions by what they're wearing and by the fact that they could take a photograph. I don't know. I feel like those we can trouble those assumptions. There is a certain, way of looking middle class, but that doesn't mean that you are middle class and that you have you have the same means as someone wearing the same outfit does. I think there's a lot of discrepancy in these social economic diversity that I don't think is always captured in photography as much as historians of photography think that it is. Um, so I think for Vandersee, I think there was, or I'd like to believe that there was a very kind of wide population of people who were going, from those who maybe would just go on very special occasions, like for Easter or for a wedding. And those who, I know there were some sitters who would go before they went to a Halloween party, right? So, those are two different kind of relationships with photography. But I would like to think that the diversity of, economic standing that was true to Harlem was also true to Vandersee's photographs as well.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll leave the Q&A box and the chat open for any additional questions from anyone. And I'll just use a nice little pregnant pause here.
Okay. And I think I can just use this moment of silence to plug my book, which
Please
is,
do. Go for it.
which is going to be obviously on James Vandersee. It is forthcoming with Duke University Press, and it should be coming out, fingers crossed, in 2023 or later. And in it, I talk about a lot of the topics that we've talked about today, thinking about Vandersee within a larger community of other photographers. I also really delve into his him being commissioned by Marcus Garvey, and how his images traveled through the Negro world. I talk about his later years as well, his career in the 40s and 50s, which is usually really seen as sort of a footnote in most studies of Vandersee. So I really try to take a more kind of expanded and comprehensive view of Vandersee through a relational and a material approach. So please look out for the book. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. Really appreciate you joining us this afternoon and for sharing sort of your response to the exhibit and the photos therein and the connections between these two artists who, as you said, likely never met each other, but were practicing in the same field in two very different um, spaces in our country, but were photographing African American communities in a very deliberate and passionate way. And I think it really shines through in their work. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I have put into the chat for everyone 3 links. The first is to the Franklin Research Center's homepage if you want to learn more about the center and the collections that we have therein. We actually have a digital collection of Michael Francis Blake's photographs. So the Blake collection, which is here at Duke, is all digitized, and you can view all the images in that collection online. And then I shared a link to the Franklin Research Center at 25 events. So just to do a quick little advertising, I'm also going to do some advertising. Our next event is next Wednesday, September the 22nd. We'll be joined by Dr. Brandon K. Winford, who's at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. This is our Black Lives in Archives speaker series, where we're inviting scholars to return to the archives who receive travel grants to do research in our collections here in the Rubenstein Library. So we hope you can join us. If you use that link, you can register for that event as well. That will also be virtual next Wednesday, the 22nd at 1 o'clock. And so I think at this point, I will formally end the program, but if you all have time who are in the audience, like I said in the beginning, I've got a 10-minute slideshow that I can share so you can actually see all the images used in the exhibit as well as the exhibit space. So again, I really appreciate you all for coming, and I'm actually gonna share my screen now.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure.
So thank you, Emily. And I'm gonna stop recording because